Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Vegas, where today we're going to be talking about each of the traits, and we're going to be going over what type of builds that they're really good for. New Vegas has a system where at the very start of the game, and once you're in Doc Mitchell's house, you can pick up to 2 traits. This is completely your choice. Personally, I would say that you always want to go with 2 traits, because generally the trade-offs are worth it, and generally they help a whole lot more with whatever build that you're going for, unless you're doing a specific challenge run or something like that. I would say that you always want to go with 2, because it's generally better to be specialized in something than be a generalist at everything. Now, you can be a generalist at everything in Vegas and actually do really well, but I find that specializing is a whole lot easier, especially if you're just getting into the game. So always go with 2 traits, and there is also a distinction between the different traits because we have the standard traits that are already in the game. This will include the traits Built to Destroy, Fast Shot, 4 Eyes, Good-Natured, Heavy-Handed, Kamikaze, Loose Cannon, Small Frame, Trigger Discipline, and Wild Wasteland. So you have 10 traits that you can pick from in the base game. However, there is an additional 6 traits that are added with the Old World Blues DLC. So if you have that DLC, these traits should be unlocked. I have gotten reports of people not having these unlocked even though they have Old World Blues, and it might just not be installed correctly. I'm not sure, you might want to try to uninstall and reinstall that. I've never ran into that issue, so I'm not sure what causes it. But with these 6 traits, you also get the addition of Claustrophobia, Early Bird, Hoarder, Hot-Blooded, Logan's Loophole, and Skilled. So let's talk about each of these and why you might want to take them and what sort of builds that they work really well at. So starting out with Built to Destroy, this is a pretty straightforward trait. This one gives you 3% increased crit chance for every single weapon, which is generally quite good. Crits are usually a pretty solid option, but the penalty is that all of your weapons break 15% faster, so they have less overall item health. Now, breaking weapons faster can be something that is a little bit annoying. This depends on how you'd like to build, because there are perks like jury rigging, which can make it so you don't have to worry about breaking your weapons as much because you can fix them up with more readily available weapons. If you know how to get a lot of money in this game, you can have other people repair your stuff for you. You could also go with weapon repair kits, which allow you to build up your weapon too. As well as if you go to the Lonesome Road, you can also have Eddie fix up your gear, so that certainly helps. This is actually a pretty strong trait and generally considered one of the better traits in Fallout New Vegas, because even though this is going to potentially hurt you in the early game, it's going to help you out a whole lot more as the game goes on with most builds. This one is really good for a guns build, an energy weapon build, a melee build, or an unarmed build. However, it is really bad for an explosives build. The main reason for that is explosives do not hit crits, or if they do hit crits, they do no additional crit damage on top of their regular damage. So crits for an explosive build are just not worth it. So Built to Destroy, pretty decent. That one's one of the more straightforward traits. Let's move on to the next one, which is called Fast Shot. So this makes it so you have an increased rate of fire with all guns and energy weapons. This is by 20% increased rate of fire, as well as you get a 20% reduction in action point costs whenever you're using it. The downside to this one, though, is that you have 20% more spread, and you have 20% less accuracy in VATS with energy weapons and with guns. So this one initially seems like it'd be better for fast shooting weapons, which it actually is pretty decent for fast shooting weapons, like fully automatic weapons that aren't the most accurate if you're using them at very close range can still get a benefit from this. However, where this perk really shines is actually in very accurate weapons that have a slow rate of fire. So things like bolt action rifles or lever action rifles, pump shotguns, all of these have fairly slow rates of fire, but they do have high accuracy. So the accuracy penalty that you get is actually not that big of a deal, because if you're already extremely accurate, pretty much pinpoint accurate with something like a hunting rifle, being 20% less accurate than almost dead on accurate isn't that big of a deal. You're not going to notice that at all, but the increased rate of fire you will probably notice, and the reduced action point cost you'll also pretty much notice. So this is pretty good on a VATS build as well. If you want to take something like All American, Fast Shot is a really, really good option. There is an interesting interaction with Fast Shot and with Trigger Discipline if you take both of them though, because one makes it so you're more accurate and one makes it so you're less accurate. However, these are percentage based, so if you end up taking Fast Shot and Trigger Discipline, this doesn't actually cancel them out and it results back into a 0. This actually results in a negative towards you, to where you actually end up spending more action points and you're less accurate than you otherwise would be. So if you take both those traits, it's actually a straight nerf to your build, regardless of what build you're running, unless you plan on using like a melee or an unarmed build exclusively, in which case then you're just at neutral. But on a guns build, you're actually at a deficit, so that one's not as good. Fast Shot is actually pretty good on most builds. It's actually really effective on most builds, particularly VATS builds and particularly guns builds that are fairly accurate, whether that be energy weapons or regular ballistic weapons. Up next we have 4 Eyes. 4 Eyes actually does come with a requirement where you have to have less than 10 perception, but you do have to have higher than 1 perception in order to get this. This is our first trait that actually has a requirement to it, although it's on the extreme ends of having either high perception or no perception. This one gives you +2 perception so long as you're wearing glasses. This is a temporary +2, and we'll talk about that here in a second. However, the penalties are that you lose 1 base perception, which is a pretty big penalty. That's -1 to your special stats that you're not getting back. This is a pretty terrible trait. I think this is actually the worst trait in the entire game. The penalty is not outweighing the bonus that it gets. +2 perception is only +2 perception in terms of stats and in terms of skill checks. This is not in terms of which perks that you can actually take, because that +2 is just a temporary +2. So if you had 5 perception and you decided to take this, you would go down to -1 from that, so you'd go to 4 perception, and then if you equip glasses, you go up to +6, but your base stat would still be at a 4. So any perks that require 6 perception in order for you to get, you could not get because of this. So unless you wanted to buff it up in other ways, like taking intense training or taking the implants to buff it up a little bit more. This is also really bad because perception is one of the least used skills in New Vegas. It's really only there for perks. It's not really there for anything else, because there's a common misconception in New Vegas where perception affects how accurate you are in VATS. That is correct in Fallout 4, and I believe it was correct in Fallout 3 as well, but in Fallout New Vegas that is not correct. It doesn't do anything for your VATS. This will only buff up your skills that are affected by perception, so this would be lockpicking, explosives, and energy weapons. But those are, again, just temporary buffs to those skills. And giving you +2 perception is not a huge buff from that. And this does also lock you into having to have glasses on. That's not such a huge deal because there are some good glasses in the game. Dr. Klein's and Dr. Mobius's glasses are really good, and the Lucky Shades are really good, so you do have some options there. But with this just being a detriment to your special stats and the bonus being extremely minimal, 4 Eyes is really only good on a character build, so I would not recommend that you take this unless you know that you're just going to take it to have a themed character. You want to play as a nerd, you want to play as a specific character that wears glasses, maybe you want to play as like Gordon Freeman or something. Fine, then the 4 Eyes can actually work really well in those sort of builds. In any other build, I would recommend that you stay completely away from 4 Eyes. Our next trait is Good Nature. This has the benefit of giving you +5 to your barter, medicine, repair, science, and speech, but it comes with the downside of giving you -5 to your energy weapons, explosives, guns, melee, and unarmed. So you go 5 for 5 in terms of stats, where you get 5 points relocated to more of your passive skills, I guess, things like repair and science, medicine and barter. So you can potentially do other skill checks there, but all of your combat stats go down by 5. This one is another trait that is generally considered quite good. Obviously, this would be quite good on a pacifist run where combat skills don't really matter. However, even on a combat run, this one is quite good because most of the time people are only going to be taking 1 to 2 of your combat stats as their main way of fighting. You don't really need to max out your character, and generally you're not going to be maxing out all the combat stats first on a character, since generally you're just going to pick one particular type of fighting style that you like, whether that be unarmed, melee, usually those two actually go together, explosives, energy weapons, or guns. Any of those are fine if you just pick one of them, and then at that point you're only losing 5 to that one stat, and you're getting +25 to those other stats, which will really help with any sort of build. So Good Natured can be quite a good one, unless you're going to go with a build that you're just going to max out everything and you don't care about the stat spread based on the perks. So this one is pretty nice, unless you're going with like a really high intelligence character, or you plan on hunting down all the books, in which case then you're going to be able to max out your character pretty much regardless, at least in terms of their skills. But Good Nature can give you a pretty big advantage in the early game for passing a lot of speech checks within Good Springs and within the surrounding towns, so that can actually be really nice. Our next trait is Heavy Handed. Heavy Handed gives you the benefit of +20% more melee and unarmed damage. This is pretty nice. That's actually a huge buff in damage to those particular types of weapons. However, the penalty is a -60% crit damage. This is both for unarmed and melee. This can be kind of a downside because melee and unarmed do usually have pretty good crits, and heavy-handed is generally not considered one of the best traits in the game. However, there are certain builds that you can run with this. Obviously, this is meant for an unarmed or a melee build, so there's no reason to take this if you don't plan on using either of those weapon types. If you do plan on using those weapon types and you want to run with a low luck character, a low crit chance character, then heavy-handed is actually pretty decent. Or if you're using weapons that already have fairly low crit damage but have very high base damage. So this can be pretty decent on certain weapon types if you want to take it with, let's say, the Fire Axe, where the Fire Axe has kind of low crits but has pretty good base damage, or something like the Super Sledge that also has really high base damage but a little bit lower on the crits. And if you're running a low luck character where you're not really relying on crits, then heavy-handed can actually be pretty good. Up next we have Kamikaze. Kamikaze's bonus is that you get plus 10 action points, but it comes with the penalty of minus 2 to your damage threshold and minus 15% damage resist. So this one is definitely geared towards a VATS build, and VATS builds can be quite strong. However, this makes it so even if you're doing more damage or can do more damage with your VATS attacks, you are still taking more damage in return. This might actually not be such a big deal depending on the enemy type. Either you are so tanky that the enemy can't really hurt you, or the enemy is so strong that it can one-shot you, in which case the amount of damage that you take doesn't really matter. Say if you're playing on like the very hard hardcore difficulty, and let's say you're running a low endurance character, and you go to the Courier's Mile where the Death Claws can one-shot you basically all the time, in which case Kamikaze is actually not really that much of a downside since you're just kind of getting the bonus action points at that point. This one can be kind of a downside into the early game. This one is going to be best on like a sniper build character, or even just a stealth character in general. This could still be melee or unarmed as well. You don't really see like stealth explosive builds, but stealth sniper is probably where Kamikaze fits the best. And if you want to be going with the dedicated VATS build. If you're not going with the dedicated VATS build, or you just don't find yourself using VATS very often, Kamikaze is probably going to be a trait that you overlook. I think that this is an okay trait overall, but not necessarily one of the strongest. I personally don't use VATS all that much, and losing the damage threshold and losing that damage resist does kind of hurt. Loose Cannon gives you the benefit of throwing weapons have an increased rate of fire, or an increased throw speed, of 30%, so you can toss these out 30% faster than you otherwise would. The penalty, though, is that any of these thrown weapons have a minus 25% in terms of velocity and range, so you can't throw them quite as far as you otherwise would. This does only affect thrown weapons. This is not like something like Heave Ho, where Heave Ho is a perk that actually affects other weapons other than just thrown ones, even though it only says thrown ones. It still affects things like the grenade launcher and the grenade rifles, which makes it actually a really good perk for explosives builds. This one is an interesting trait because there is only thrown explosives and thrown melee weapons. So if you're not going with melee or explosives, then this is not really going to do anything for you, and you might as well not take it. Thrown melee weapons are fairly difficult to get a lot of them to make them worthwhile in the game, so that's not really a huge selling point. Thrown explosives are much easier to get, and you can get quite a lot of them. You can also make a lot of these with perks like Mad Bomber, so that certainly helps. And for certain explosives like Dynamite, this can actually be kind of nice since you can throw out multiple of these before they would go off, since they have the fuse time. On other explosives, this one is still kind of dangerous because if you're throwing them closer to you, there's more of a chance that those explosions can hurt you back. So I don't really see Loose Cannon being the most useful trait in the game. It's only really good on very specific builds, and most characters are not going to be running thrown weapons as like their primary means of attack. That's usually something to kind of just toss in or to have fun with. It works the best on explosives builds, but even then, I don't even think explosives builds really needs to have Loose Cannon. So if you want to take this, fine, but if not, I don't think you're missing out on much. A small frame does have a requirement, just like Four Eyes does. This just makes it so you have to have less than 10 agility in order to take this, which you really shouldn't be taking 10 in any special stat at the very start of New Vegas, because you can get the implants, which will give you another +1 to them, so probably don't want to be doing that. Small frame gives you +1 agility for the penalty of you taking 25% more damage to your limbs, so your limbs are going to be breaking faster. Now, taking extra limb damage doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be taking more direct damage, but it does make it so basically whenever you're fighting explosives, you should probably plan to have broken limbs afterwards, to where you're going to need to fix those up either with stim packs in the regular game or doctor's bags in the hardcore difficulty. They can also fix them up in the normal difficulty too. It's just they are the only way to fix up limbs besides going to a doctor. So small frame can have a little bit of a downside, but generally I would consider small frame a pretty good trait. I think it's generally regarded as a pretty good trait amongst the community. You can also get the challenge perk Tough Guy a lot faster with this, which if you get that, that's for breaking your limbs, I believe 25 times. just on anything. You can break them just by falling off of stuff or by stepping on lower level explosives. You're going to take some broken limbs regardless of whatever you're fighting. They'll probably break your limbs at some point since you have small frame. And then Tough Guy can actually give you plus 25 resistance to breaking your limbs, so this will negate it out, which is actually pretty good. Then it's just a plus 1 to your agility stat. A plus 1 to your special stat is a pretty big investment, especially right at the start. So small frame I would consider a very good trait overall. You could also take the perk Adamantium Skeleton, which also gives you bonus damage resistance for each of your limbs, so they're less likely to break too. That helps out a lot too if you want to take that, and if you're planning on already taking it, then small frame can actually be pretty good. And it's pretty good for most builds, since agility is one of the better combat stats. Pretty much every style of combat enjoys having extra agility, since it's tied to both your reload speed as well as your action points. So builds like Unarmed and Melee really like it, since they like VATS a lot, and then all the others, guns, explosives, and energy weapons, do like to reload faster, so having bonus agility is generally pretty good. Up next is Trigger Discipline. Trigger Discipline makes it so you get 20% more accuracy with guns and energy weapons. However, you reduce your rate of fire by 25% with those weapons, and all of your VATS attacks cost 20% more action points to use. Trigger Discipline looks pretty decent on paper because, you know, you take a rifle and then it's even more accurate, so you can pick off enemies at a distance. However, it's actually really bad with rifles. This is also a very interesting perk in that it doesn't actually affect fully automatic weapons. So fully automatic weapons, which would benefit from this the most by giving them more accuracy, aren't actually affected by it. This is only like semi-auto rifles, bolt action rifles, and I guess semi-auto handguns as well as revolvers. The same type of way to where this is just pretty much a nerf to your character in most regards. And as discussed earlier, if you take this with Fast Shot, you're actually nerfing your overall action points and your overall rate of fire, which is really bad. So Trigger Discipline might look like a decent trait, but it's actually one of the worst traits in my opinion. I think Fast Shot is immensely more useful because if you want to make a gun more accurate, it's actually much better if it's a full auto gun that's not very accurate to begin with, to where it gets that big increase since it's a 20% bonus, as opposed to a rifle that's already incredibly accurate. If it's slightly more accurate, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to notice it either. It's kind of the same thing that we discussed with Fast Shot, where if your rifle is pinpoint accurate and it's slightly less accurate all of a sudden, it's still basically the same as it was before. You just have an increased rate of fire. In this case, you have a rifle that's pretty much pinpoint accurate and you made it slightly more accurate to where you're not going to notice that, but you are going to notice the slower rate of fire that you got otherwise. So Trigger Discipline, just not worth it. And then our last regular trait is Wild Wasteland. This one's a very interesting trait and a fan favorite because this one makes it so that you have additional wacky and strange content throughout the game. So various encounters can happen when you have Wild Wasteland. You get a ton of different movie references. You get a ton of references to TV shows, other games. It can be a really fun overall trait. The only downside that this one actually comes with is that you can't get the unique Gauss rifle. You can get the Alien Blaster because that replaces where it's at. The Alien Blaster is pretty strong, but it's not as strong as the unique Gauss rifle. That one's just a much better gun overall because the Alien Blaster, even though it could have more DPS than something like the Gauss rifle, it's not going to have as much damage per shot, and it also has limited ammo. So once you run out of ammo with the Alien Blaster, it's completely useless. You can't use it for anything else unless you just want to sell it. The Gauss rifle is never going to have that problem to where it's never going to run out of ammo. So you might not want to take it if you plan on getting that specific weapon. If you're not going with an energy weapon build though, then Wild Wasteland can be a pretty tempting option. Or if you weren't planning on using the Gauss rifle, then the Wild Wasteland can be a pretty tempting option because it adds a whole lot more silly things to the game. So if you want to take this one, by all means take it. It's a fairly neutral trait overall. Then we have the Old World Blues traits, where our very first one is Claustrophobia. So Claustrophobia gives you +1 to all of your special stats so long as you're outdoors, and it gives you -1 to your special stats so long as you're indoors. These are both temporary bonuses or negatives towards your special stats. So these don't count towards any sort of your perks. These ones are just bonuses to the actual special stat and to all the skills that they govern. This one's a 1-for-1 trade-off. You are generally outside more often throughout New Vegas. However, there are plenty of indoor locations, and most indoor locations are where there's unique enemies. There's not a whole lot of them just out and around in the wasteland. Generally, they're in a specific cave or they're inside of areas. Most of the Sierra Madre takes place inside, so in that DLC, this one's not as good. For other builds, it's not really going to be a pro or a con to them. Our next one is Early Bird. Early Bird is another pretty straightforward trait where this one gives you +2 to all of your special stats between 6 a.m. and 12 p.m. However, you get -1 from all of your special stats between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. So you get a pretty decent chunk of the day to where you're going to be getting +2, which can really help for certain speech checks, certain skill checks. This can be pretty nice. The -1, anytime that it's night, is a downside. These are both temporary bonuses, and there's also going to be a time during the afternoon of the day, anytime from noon till 6, to where you don't actually have any downside or upside to taking early bird. This one's actually pretty fun for role-playing purposes. If it's like, I have to get to bed before I get the negatives towards this, and you're only trying to play within the window where you get the +2 special stats, or to where you're just going neutral in special stats. Outside of that, it's not necessarily that much of a pro. It is more of a pro than it is a con, though. So I would recommend early bird if you want to go with some more role-playing purpose like traits. This one can actually be pretty fun in that regard. Hoarder gives you the benefit of +25 to your carry weight, which is a pretty big bonus to your carry weight. However, the penalty is that you get -1 to all of your special stats if your total carry weight is below 160 pounds. That's a decent amount of items that you're going to need to be carrying around. Usually you don't need to be carrying that many around, but Hoarder can actually be quite good on an explosives build, or if you're going with a hoarding build, if you just want to loot everything, Hoarder can be pretty good, assuming that you're always going to have a really high amount of carry weight. Explosives is where I would say it's the best, because explosives are generally quite heavy, and if you're playing on the hardcore difficulty, then the ammunition is also fairly heavy, and it makes it so you can at least hoard a decent amount of stuff whenever you need to use it. This one I would generally consider a pro more so than a con, but it's not a massive pro. This one does make it so that you can get an even higher amount of total carry weight, where normally you'd be able to go up to 375 in total carry weight, I believe. With this, you can actually go up to 400 weight in total if you'd like to do that. You will need to have 10 strength, you're going to need strong back, you're going to need burden to bear as perks that you're going to get with this, and you're also going to be having to wear the courier's duster that gives you extra carry weight as well. But if you stack all of those on top of it and you have Hoarder, then you can carry around a ton of extra weight if you would like to do that. This one can also be kind of nice in the early game, because generally what I do in Good Springs is just go around and steal everything from all the houses so I can sell it to Chet to get a big boost in money at the start. Hoarder does actually help out with that, to where I'm not going to have to run back and forth as often, but I am going to need to carry around more stuff in the early game than I otherwise really would be carrying around. Up next we have Hot Blooded. Hot Blooded gives you 15% bonus damage with all weapons, so long as your health is 50% or below. The negative to this is that you get -2 perception and -2 agility when your health is below 50%. This one can actually be pretty decent, although this one is a little bit bugged to where it says it gives you 10% bonus damage. It's actually 15%. It's just says that incorrectly on all versions of the game. I'm not sure why. This one's actually pretty good. I would sometimes recommend Hot Blooded, especially if you plan on injuring your character to where you're constantly staying at 50% health or less. This isn't really the best if you're playing on like the very hard hardcore difficulty, because generally you want to be at high health just so that the enemies that hit really hard can't just one-shot you. If you're at 50% health, there's plenty of enemies that can, no matter what level you are. At that point, like Deathclaws can kill you really fast, Tunnelers, Kazdors can kill you really quick. Anybody with a big gun like a brush gun or a 50 cal has a high chance of killing you with one shot or killing you very quickly with 2 shots. This one I would recommend, if you're playing on that difficulty, to go with more of a sniper build so that you get more damage at longer range to where you can stay safe with this. On lower difficulties, this one can be pretty good on any sort of character, and it's not bad on like a melee or an unarmed character, even if you plan on having high health. There is still going to be at times where you get knocked to half health and then you just get that huge buff in damage right there, which is pretty good. You could also potentially combine this with other damaging perks. Anything that gives you specific damage buffs like Cowboy or Grunt, or you could take it with other perks like Eye for Eye, which make it so you get more damage with each crippled limb. And if you have all crippled limbs and you have low health, then it's going to give you a huge buff in damage, and you can kill things pretty effectively with it. And this one's more of a risky trait, but it can be pretty good. Our next trait is Logan's Loophole. This one makes it so chems last twice as long as they otherwise would, and the addiction rate is set at 0, so you can be addicted to any sort of chem if you want to take this. However, the penalty is that you have a total level limit set to 30. Normally, if you're playing with all the DLCs, you can go all the way up to level 50, so this is cutting your total amount of levels that you can get by 20. That's a huge amount of level loss. Having the ability to never get addicted to chems and having chems last twice as long is really, really strong, especially when chems are so strong. Taking things like Psycho, Slasher, Turbo, Rushing Water can all be really good with Logan's Loophole, and they even pair better if you have a perk like Chemist or Day Tripper, which are really nice so that you can have even longer lasting chems basically going all the time. Limiting your level to 30 does kind of suck. However, you don't necessarily need to take this right away because you can re-roll your traits. You can actually re-roll them twice since you get the initial ability to choose them right at the very start. Then you can choose them once again whenever you leave Goodsprings. So if you want to go with this one, you can. Or you can go to Old World Blues, and once you have all the things set up for the auto dock, then he can reset them once for you. And if you get all the way up to level 50 first, then you can actually grab Logan's Loophole later, and you will be set to level 30, but you'll have all the perks and all the stats that you had when you were at level 50. You'll just also get twice the chem duration and no addiction rate. At that point, you could say Logan's Loophole is a little bit redundant because you're probably already maxed out with everything, and just having Chemist alone is quite strong. But for whatever reason, if you wanted to be even stronger, you could do that. So Logan's Loophole can be pretty good. And if you don't plan on doing all the DLCs and you're just going to be running through the game normally where you don't think that you're going to be getting above level 30, Logan's Loophole can also be a pretty decent one. I personally don't take this one that often, but it can be a pretty good trait overall, so long as you know what you're doing. And then our very last trait is called Skilled. And Skilled gives you the benefit of having +5 to all of your stats. So this is things like guns, explosives, repair, anything like that. You get +5 to all of them. The penalty is that you lose 10% of your total XP that you gain. This one is just a straight bonus to every character, in my opinion. The -10 to your experience does not matter. Some people have pointed out that you can take like Swift Learner or just have Well Rested and you'll cancel this out. I don't even think that those are worth it. Well Rested is fine because you can always get it in game. I think that Swift Learner is one of the worst perks in the entire game, so I just wouldn't take it. Losing 10% of your total XP that you gain just doesn't matter, and having +5 to all of your stats is such a huge bonus in the early game. Not only that, but Skilled is actually bugged. So you can take Skilled right as you go to Doc Mitchell's house, go to Leave Goodsprings, respec your character, pick Skilled again, and it will give you a second stack of Skilled. So you'll go from +5 to every stat to +10 to every stat at the very start of the game, and it doesn't actually carry over the negative. It's not then -20% to your experience gain, it's still the -10%. So this one is really good. It's also kind of weird how it interacts with other perks too, because any XP gaining perks, like Here and Now, this one actually kind of messes it up, where if you have Skilled and then you take Here and Now, which is supposed to get you 1 level's worth of experience, it gives you 1 level's worth of experience, but then it takes that 10% away so you don't quite level up. Another reason not to take Here and Now, which is already a pretty garbage perk. Skilled makes it a little bit worse, but you probably shouldn't be taking it to begin with. Skilled is probably the best trait in the game, and I'd recommend it for every single character, unless you're going with specific character builds. And one other thing, you can actually take this a third time. I sort of lied with saying that you could take it twice. You can actually take it 3 times. Once at Doc Mitchell's house, once when you're leaving Goodsprings, and once again when you're at the sink. If you want the auto dock to reset you, you can grab Skilled once more, and then you can have +15 to all of your stats without the negative of the XP gains over each time. So yeah, this one's really good if you know that. Even if you don't want to be messing around with that and kind of abuse it to where you get more overall stats, still having +5 to all of your stats is really, really strong. That's a huge buff right at the very start of the game for speech checks, for skill checks, for whatever stats that you're going to actually be tagging, and for whatever stats you're going to be building up. You can build up your stats even quicker than you otherwise would. So which trait should you take in New Vegas then? Well, it kind of depends on your build. There's plenty of options. Some of the ones that I'd recommend would be like Built to Destroy if you're going with a crit build, unless you're going with explosives. Fast Shot works pretty well on most guns and energy weapon builds, unless you're going with something specific. Good Natured is pretty good for a big starting bonus, so that one's nice, especially if you don't plan on going with all combat stats early on. Heavy Hitter can be useful on particular melee weapon builds, but not always on all of them. Kamikaze can be decent on VATS builds if you want to go with that. Small Frame is pretty good on most builds so long as you want more agility and you're okay with the extra limb damage. Wild Wasteland is always a fan favorite, so if you want to take that one, feel free to. Early Bird can be pretty decent if you want to have more role-playing purposes and you want that little bit of bonus in the early morning. Hoarder can be good on explosive builds and just builds that want to be carrying around more junk. Hot-Blooded can be particularly good on like sniper builds or on melee builds. Logan's Loophole can be good so long as you know what you're doing and you want to have those extra abilities to not take chems. And then Skilled is good on every single trait. The other traits are limiting in one way or another, and I wouldn't really recommend them that much, but all the rest of them can be pretty decent. Tell me your thoughts on the traits and which traits you take the most often in New Vegas. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.